question I often get is, what printer should I choose if I want to get into making my own 3D printed lures and molds? And that's an easy question and a complicated question at the same time. So I'm going to dive into some things you should consider before you choose a 3D printer. First up, there's really two main types of printers in the home consumer market. There's the FDM printer, which takes plastic, shoots it through a nozzle that's been heated, kind of builds up layers over time. That's probably the one you've seen the most of, and it's been out in the consumer market the longest. Then there is Resin 3D printers. These are relatively new to the consumer market, although they're built on older technology. This is kind of the technology that was used at the beginning of 3D printing, using resins and light to cure them. Now, both of these printing styles have their pluses and minuses. So FDM is easier to post-process. There's really not much post-processing. You can print a part, you can pull it right off the build plate and use it for the most part, right? You don't need to do much to it. In a fishing lure, we know we're gonna paint it, we wanna have the best finish, so we're probably gonna sand it, and there could be some other things. The materials that you use primarily are gonna be PLA, PETG, which has some higher heat resistance. They have ABS plastic, and all of these things are a little more difficult to print, and they take different kind of environments, right? So ABS, you generally have to have an enclosed space that's heated, all this kind of good stuff. And I will say that by and large, none of the materials are really great for molds. I would go so far as say you just don't want to do a mold in an FDM printer unless you already own an FDM printer. Then you might want to do a few things with it, but it can't really handle the heat of the plastisol when you inject it. It will deform over time, or worst case, just melt as soon as you inject it in there. They're generally 1 to 5 shot molds. FDM printers are also a little more difficult to set up initially. They have a larger build plate that usually has 4 kind of screws on the outside. You have to level each of the 4 corners, and it takes quite some time. And the results at the end of the day are not as detailed as resin printers. That's why I toss FDM out of the consideration right from the beginning. Unless you have a very specific use, or you already own one, just don't get one. Now, resin 3D printers have a lot of advantages over FDM in terms of resolution, ease of setup, but they do have one fairly major con, and that is the post-processing. After a resin 3D print finishes, I have to clean it, usually in some sort of solvent, isopropyl alcohol, denatured alcohol, acetone, something along those lines. And then I have to cure it either outside in the sun or in a UV chamber that I've made or that I've purchased. However, you get some amazing results. We're talking about layer lines that are 0.04 millimeters, which is 40 nanometers. Super duper detailed. This is what most fishing lure makers want, whether you're making molds or whether you're making lures themselves. So another big difference between FDM and resin is print time. And it's really print time with multiple objects on your printer. On a resin 3D printer, the only thing that dictates how long a print is going to take is the distance between the build plate and the very bottom of the model that I'm printing. So I can print a solid build plate, like XY back forth solid block of resin to, let's just say, 50 millimeters in depth. And that's going to take exactly as much time to print as if I was printing a 1 millimeter diameter cylinder that's 50 millimeters long, straight up and down. It makes no difference. And that is a giant advantage when you're talking about printing molds and printing lure bodies. And let's talk about the resins real quick. You're gonna be printing in a UV cured resin, and they have a wide variety of these resins available. One of the things that drew me to resin 3D printing specifically for mold making is a resin called Outtakes Sculpt. It has a heat deflection temperature of 320 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right around what you would shoot normal plastisol at, right? Around 350 or below. Now I can go on a rant about heat deflection temperature, but I'll link a video at the end of this that discusses it in detail, but just know it's not an absolute number. It is a number derived from a test of the material at a certain thickness and under a certain amount of pressure or load. My finding is that when I make these lure molds, I'm printing at a much thicker material than they test at. And I've shot molds on accident at 420 degrees Fahrenheit with no damage whatsoever. So just know that it is not like at 321 degrees, the thing just turns into a big pile of goo. That just doesn't happen. So resin 3D printers are really the only 3D printers I would recommend if you want to make molds. There's really no other choice in my book. Now let's talk about lures and lure blanks, if you will, because we're gonna paint them. Resin 3D printers are fantastic at producing amazing details, And again, we have a wide variety of resins to choose from which have different properties. So far, I've been printing all of my lure bodies in a combination of resins, Outtakes build mixed with a little tenacious, which, by the way, that's something you can't do on an FDM printer. You can't do custom formalizations. You get one material pretty much. Now I know some guys going like, well, they have IDX printers with 2 build heads, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's 2 different materials layered on top of each other. That's not a combination. So tenacious is a very, very flexible resin, and build is a very accurate resin that was designed to be drilled and tapped. Combining the 2 together so far has given me the best results of my lures. More experimentation on that coming up. Okay, now I've convinced you to get a resin printer. Which one to get? So there's 2 things that are must-have in my book. High resolution, 2K for a smaller printer, 4K for a mid-sized printer, and mono LCD screens. That's gonna give you much faster print times. There's no reason to get a resin printer today that doesn't have those 2 things, unless you wanna save maybe $20. It's really, just don't do it. So then really what it comes down to is size, right? The guts of these printers are all made by one company, Chi2 Systems. They make the main controller boards and they make the LCD screens. So manufacturers have a little bit of variability, but you're really not gonna see any difference between the print quality from one 4K mono Chi2 Systems printer and another. So think about what you wanna print the most of. If you're here because you wanna print molds for soft plastics, I would largely throw out the smaller printers. You're going to want to print larger molds, if not for larger baits, at least for multi-cavity molds, just because it's way more efficient. And it's difficult to do that on a smaller printer unless you're like only going to print like super tiny crappie lures or something like that. So molds, larger printers, end of story. If you're here because you largely want to print lure blanks, then you can consider the smaller size printers. One thing to keep in mind though is you're going to be limited on how big of a lure blank you can print and the number that you can print at one time. On a smaller printer, you might only be able to get 3 lure bodies at a time, or on a mid-sized printer, I can often get 5 to 8 at one time. And the print time between 1 lure and 5 lures is exactly the same. So let's take a look at some specific printer models that I use in my kind of day-to-day printing. Now, I only currently have mid-sized printers. I, in the past, have had smaller resin printers, particularly the Creality LD002H printer. And again, all of these are pretty much the same when it comes to quality of the prints you're gonna get off. I know a lot of people use the Elegoo Mars line, which is their smaller 3D printer. They have a Mars 3 now, Mars 2. Both of those are good. Epax has a E something or rather, maybe an E1, I think. Again, good solid choice. Anycubic has their Photon Mono small size printer, and all of these are good choices, right? I tend to avoid the kind of off-brand printers, and again, not because they're going to be any less quality than the name brand printers, just the name brand companies tend to have better support. One of the things in resin printing that a lot of people don't realize is the LCD screen is a consumable part. It will eventually run out and fail, and you will need to replace it. And so being able to contact the manufacturer, make sure you're getting the right LCD screen is pretty important. For me, that's why I go with Epax printers. They're US based, they always seem to have parts in stock. And so for me, I kind of run my 3D printing as a business for this YouTube channel. I do lure design for folks. I don't want a lot of downtime. For you, that might be different, but generally, you're gonna wanna go with a name brand. So if you choose from any of those name brand printers, it's really pretty simple. Pick it based on size. And of course, the budget is the key. You know, when people contact me and say, hey, what 3D printer do you recommend? First thing I ask them is how much money can you reasonably spend, right? I can get a mid-sized printer that costs $15,000 if I wanna go with some specialty dental printer, or I can get one as low end as $399, the VoxLab Proxima 8.9 I have, right? One of them is gonna have some quirks, the one that doesn't cost as much, and the high-end one, I can probably get someone to fly out to my house and install it for me, right? That's the main difference. But if you're just getting started out and you're not sure if you're gonna be into it or not, I would probably recommend a smaller printer to start, right? You can print some single cavity molds, you can print lure bodies, and you can generally get into that for under $200 for the printer. If you have a little bit more money to spend, maybe between that $400 and $700 range, I would highly recommend getting a mid-size resin printer. You will never be kind of wondering why you got a bigger printer, right? You always kind of want to end up printing bigger or more stuff, right? You saw in some of my wake bait videos, some of my lure videos, if you can print 1 lure, you can print 5, and you might as well print 5. It's gonna cost you a few more dollars in resin, and you have 5 of them within 5 hours. that's just better. Hey guys, I hope you found this helpful. There's links in the description for a lot of the printers that I mentioned here that I would recommend. Either I personally use or I have friends that use and get good results down in the link below. I have a deal with Outtakes where you get 5% off of any of their printers. But right now, in December of 2021, I would strongly look at the Anycubic Mono X. It's on Black Friday sale, I think still, for $4.99. That's a pretty killer deal right now. All the videos I mentioned are in this playlist right here. Take care, tight lines. So a question I often get is, why do you move your hands around so much? No. A question I often level the build plate. What the heck was that? There's a cat behind me.